What is going on, guys? And welcome back to Building the Board. This time, we're going to be going over some cornerbacks. I'm Robert Schmitz. This is hosted by OnTap Sportsnet, and I'm here with Nick. Nick, what is your last name?
Demao, Demao. It's Italian. Everyone says Demao, but it is Demao. It's nice to work with you, Robert. I've
I love it,
followed
Nick.
you on Twitter for years, so I'm excited to chat cornerbacks with you.
I'm stoked. I think
Yes,
my favorite part about this, as we just kick this discussion off, cornerbacks and safeties are the two positions that I believe ultimately drove the Chiefs to the success that they obviously saw this season in winning a Super Bowl. With what we saw from guys like Trent McDuffie, L'Jarius Sneed, and the rest of their defensive backs was stuff that the rest of the league really isn't investing a lot into, though I think it's reaping crazy returns. And even crazier, Nick, is the part where these guys are the guys you see the least on the screen because they're the
exactly.
first guys to leave the broadcast angle.
Yeah,
They're the last guys to get back in it. And when the quarterback finally sees a busted coverage, oh, well, finally you see the DB and he's 5 yards off the wide receiver. So it makes for such a fun position because you really have to know your stuff as you dig into this. And if
yeah.
you can find some of these diamonds in the rough, man, they are team changing.
Exactly. I mean, I know a lot of Bears fans when Ryan Poles came over from the Chiefs. That first draft, he took back-to-back defensive backs, and people were scratching their heads saying, where's the offense? Where are the skill players for Justin Fields? And right away, Kyler Gordon, Jaquan Brisker both have grown into stalwarts on the defense. So you can see how they've taken something that I think a lot of the league is catching on to now, and they've turned it into something that's been a back end of the defense that's a strength for this Bears unit going forward.
I completely agree, Nick. And talk me through that, right? You just mentioned two picks, but the Bears have a lot more invested in this secondary than just two second round picks from what, 2 years ago?
They
How do
do.
you feel about the Bears cornerbacking situation right now?
I really like it. I mean, I know we're talking cornerback, so people are going to say, well, they're not going to invest any heavy capital in the cornerback position, and I tend to agree, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't talk about them. I do. It starts with Jalen Johnson. He was an old Ryan Pace draft pick, second round out of Utah, and he's grown into a shutdown top end cornerback in
Mhm.
the league. Barring something unfathomable happening where he's not on the roster, he's going to be on the team next year, whether it's a franchise tag or long-term extension. Opposite him, you've got Tyreek Stevenson, another second-round pick who was blossoming into a great cornerback last year. You've got Jaquan Brisker, Kyler Gordon, who in this new age, 11 personnel, Sean McVay driven offenses, you need a slot corner like Kyler Gordon that can match up against receivers and tight ends, but also come up and play the run. And then, we had to bid adieu to Eddie Jackson, who was here forever, but that's really the only hole in the defensive backfield right now. You can always use more depth, but they've got a deep secondary, they've got a really good secondary, and I think if they can find some value in the draft in the cornerback position, maybe some special teams guys or some diamonds in the rough, and then try to find a replacement for Eddie Jackson, they could have one of the top units in the entire league.
I agree. I mean, it has me really excited. Look, I get it that there's so many Bears podcasts out there that'll just say the most homer thing possible because it's fun to say at the time. But the Bears defensive backfield right now looks legitimately strong. And it's incredibly underrated because people catch on to corners generally 1 year, if not 2 years late, as opposed to
Yes.
in the moment. And so when you get guys like Kyler, Tyreek, and Jalen all playing well at the same time, you're going to see the defensive line get the credit for it, right?
Right,
You're going to see
right,
the linebackers get the credit for it.
right, right.
And then finally, we'll give the corners some credit. But to address the elephant in the room before we do start talking a little bit more about the roster and then digging into some of these draft picks, Matt Eberflus said in a press conference just the other day, the same phrase that I have caught myself parroting over the last 2 years. You can never have too many good DBs. And so, yes, this conversation we're about to have absolutely matters because with Jalen Johnson's contract status somewhat uncertain, with Tyreek Stevenson and Jalen Johnson, if memory serves, having missed some time,
Yes.
you always need that extra DB. And while Terrell Smith looked perfectly serviceable in his action, part of me wonders, look, we're going to have this conversation about a separate prospect later here, Nick, but part of me wonders whether the Bears see his future at corner or whether they saw enough scary moments of long speed and side to side breaking
Yes.
ability in Terrell's film that they might actually want to move him to safety. But who's to say
Yeah,
what complex conversations you'll have in an NFL locker room?
it's a great point, and I think Eberflus started the year, everybody expected him to run that cover 2 that he's so famous
Mhm.
for in Indy, and then he kind of switched to a more cover 3 look
Yes.
against Washington. So that adjusts the type of player you're going to look for, especially at the safety position, but also at the cornerback position. And injuries are a big one. Jalen Johnson, as far as I know, has never played a full season. He might have played one season under Matt Nagy without missing time, but I think he might have missed time for one game just for a coach's decision and not due to injury. But Jaquan Brisker seems to live in the medical tent. So it's definitely a position that seems to have a high variance for injury. So you always want to have depth. And there's a lot of guys in this secondary class that are great developmental pieces on top of, being solid starters that you can throw in pretty early on and get decent results if you put them in a proper scheme and give them good coaching.
Oh yeah. I mean, leave it to the offensive or so and while I understand want to address this quickly because Barlissimo, you're right that Terrell Smith ran faster than Tyreek Stevenson, but at least what I see on his game film is that when he's not running directly with somebody, so straight backwards, those inside breakers, things like digs, things like slants, guys are separating from Terrell pretty quickly. That's what I saw. Maybe that'll clean up as he gets a little bit more physical and learns to balance that jam at the top of at that very, very top of a route with making sure that he's running with guys, all that balance that you learn as a rookie. But that's something that I know I saw all the way from Washington to the very end of the season, where then Green Bay just hit him with in breakers, in breakers, in breakers,
Right.
and seemed like they were separating up until the point where he unfortunately got hurt and left the field.
Mhm.
I like Terrell Smith. I also don't know about you, Nick. I tend to believe that rookies in the NFL, especially at corner, if you get anything positive from them, that's a positive
Yeah. Yeah.
because rookie corners, ooh, they've got just as about a bad a transition as rookie offensive tackles do, which
Yeah.
is to say you are thrown into the fire and
Yes.
anything you do right is
It's
generally evidence of
Yeah,
some talent.
it's not like college where you can have a bad game and then there's a cupcake afterwards that you can get right. I mean, the NFL, if you have a weakness, the next guy is going to exploit it, and the next guy after that's going to exploit it. So that's one thing about Tyreek Stevenson was his wherewithal last year to kind of take his lumps early and then develop into a solid cornerback. That's something that I think this staff really looks for when they're scouting these guys is who's who's been a guy that's taken some hits in the college level, maybe gotten targeted a few times, but then came back and gave a big stop for his team. So
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, let's dive right on in.
sure, let's
Okay.
make it happen.
So if you're ready, let's kick things off with Clemson's Nate Wiggins. If you look at mock draft database and you go to their consensus board, right now Nate Wiggins is one of the highest guys rated. And it was funny, right? Because everybody in this draft class is all talking about the receivers, especially when it comes to Chicago. And my first exposure to Nate Wiggins was realizing that the reason that I thought Devontae Walker was not all that special is because I had watched the Clemson game first and the guy who lined up against him
Yeah,
all game long had just gotten the better of him. I mean, from what I have seen, Nate Wiggins kind of is all that in a bag of chips. Maybe not Witherspoon level in terms of just comparing him to older or to prospects that we've seen over the years, but Wiggins does a great job at balancing physicality with foot speed, hip fluidity. What have you seen in his tape?
yeah. I have him as my top three cornerbacks are all. It's a razor thin margin between the top three. I have him slightly edging out the next two that we'll get to. I just I have him as my most polished cornerback. I think if you were to pinpoint anyone in the class that might be a true shutdown cornerback, I could see it being Wiggins just from his size, his length, his speed, athleticism. There's this isn't a class that has a Sauce Gardner or any top end real, can't miss prospect. There is no Jalen Ramsey, there's no Sauce Gardner, there's no prospect like that. So Wiggins, when I see him, I see a great click and close. I see a guy that can sit in his zone. He'll watch a route develop. He'll close on it real fast. He'll He can run with the best of them. He's shut down. He's a real thin-framed receiver. I think he weighs like 175 pounds at 6'2". So he needs to put some muscle on. But against Florida State, they had him lined up against Johnny Wilson, who is like the mountain from Game of Thrones. I think he's 6'7", 235. And I mean, he just shut him down with his technique. I mean, he couldn't get anything going. Johnny Wilson tried to use try to out muscle him, bully ball him. And Wiggins is just, was able to run stride for stride with him, break up passes. So I really like Wiggins. I do think his run support it needs to be worked on. There's a clip from that UNC game, one of the more famous clips. He runs, I think they GPS tracked it. I think it was like 22.6 miles an hour because he runs to get Tez Walker and actually forces a fumble, which is one of the more impressive plays. But overall, when you see him in run support, he'll do his job to kind of try to funnel the run inside to his help, but he's not going to be a guy that goes out and initiate contact like some of the other guys in this class. But I do think if you were building a roster from the bottom up and you needed a shutdown cornerback that you felt good about and you had to draft one of these guys, I would personally take Nate Wiggins just because I have an affinity for larger bodied quarterbacks in the sense of height. And I do think he can add probably 15, 20 pounds and not lose much of his speed. I expect him to run probably a sub 4.4. I've heard rumblings of around a 4.3 for him. So if he can do that, put a little weight on, I think he could be a really good AJ Terrell type cornerback that would end up being the best in class. So
right. And that's a really good player if he does end up an AJ Terrell type cornerback. I do think it's funny you mentioned the run support angle of this. It is easy to get locked on to what these guys do when the ball is in the air or while there's a pass being prompted. But what they do in run support makes a big difference when it comes to defensive responsibility and how well they can execute it. This is the kind of thing that gets guys like Juju Brents pushed up the board last year, as well as, gosh, what was his name? Was it was Cam? It wasn't Jordan. Anyways, the one who went to the Dolphins, Cam Smith. That's who it was.
Yeah.
Like these bigger bodied, ultra physical corners that get nasty in the run game, that can push a lot of guys up. And I don't really think Wiggins is that kind of guy, but not unlike Christian Watson, not the same at all. But that gap between their run support and their coverage is mostly there because they're as good in coverage as they are. And hey, if you're a really good pass protecting left tackle that is only so-so in the run game, well, Olu Fashano's still getting drafted.
Exactly.
And not only that, he's still getting drafted to the top.
Exactly. And he's not a Deion Sanders in run support. He'll do his best. It's definitely a flaw in his game that I'm not sure it'll ever get. He'll never be a tenacious run stopper. I'll put it that way. He's never going to be a guy, like you said, that's going to throw his body and try to proactively stop the run. He'll do his job and he'll get his fit and he'll try to funnel it inside to his help, but he's not going to be a guy that you're going to see really go out of his way to stop the run. So that's really, my biggest, I guess critique on Wiggins overall as a pure cover corner. I really like him. He's got long arms. He's got a large frame. Like I said, his weight, I think he just needs to add muscle, or weight in general. But otherwise, I have him as my cornerback one. But like I said, between him and the next two, it's pretty razor thin.
We should address the elephant in the room. What do you think are the chances that the Bears draft a corner in the first round?
Slim to none. I would honestly it would take something wild happening, it would take something like them trading back from 9 and picking up, for some reason, if some team was so desperate to give up, I don't even know if there's a team that has multiple late round draft picks off the top of my head. I'd have to think, but if a team wanted to get up to 9 and I couldn't see it happening.
I know.
I think the earliest would have to be if they got a early-ish second round pick. And by early-ish, I mean early 40s, 45. And that would be if they had multiple. And even then I would be very surprised if they picked another corner considering the capital they put into the position.
I tend to agree with you. I mean, we said this in the pre-show. It is something that I believe that if we got onto this podcast and we didn't talk about these names, we're going to get a whole bunch of comments about how we didn't talk about any of these names. So We can run, or we could even pick up the pace if we wanted to,
Sure.
just to get to the
Sure.
guys that the Bears. Not a critique. You get it.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Just because I tend to be with you that while they're bordering on memey, they're coming up so often. Like they are becoming names that are parroted so often that
Right.
Bears fans are making it insufferable to say the name Jackson Powers Johnson, to say Zach Frazier, to
Right.
say Dallas Turner, to
Yeah.
say like Latu, to
Right.
say any receiver's name. Pick your favorite
Yeah.
receiver,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
If you did give the Bears probably as many as 3 picks in the top 40, I
Yeah.
still don't think a corner is
I
making
don't
the cut,
either. Yeah.
just because that's one of the positions they're legitimately strong at and that they've invested in pretty heavily. The moment they slap the tag on Jalen Johnson, all 3 of their starting corners will be either paid $15 million or more, or they'll be a second round pick or higher. So there's a lot of investment there. The Bears are going to want to get that ROI. That's all well and good. We like it. We still got to talk about Terrion Arnold. Now, if I had to guess, is this your corner one? Muted. Nick, you muted. Oh, I still can't hear you.
Sorry. Can you hear me?
Yes, there you go.
Sorry, my mic came I don't know what happened. My mic came unplugged. Sorry
It
about that, guys.
happens.
So I have Terry Arnold as my cornerback too. Yes. And
Oh, there you go.
and I really like him quite a bit. I have him as my cornerback too. I think he's a great athlete. Now he was probably the best run defending cornerback in the class, I thought, just at the top end. So he is a guy that, you know, you're looking for an all around cornerback. Terry Arnold's going to be the guy that you're going to want to get, but he's also raw. He was recruited as a safety by Nick Saban. He transitioned to cornerback, played opposite Kool-Aid McKinstry, started this year at corner, had his lumps, and then developed as the year went on. Had 5 interceptions, but really like 3 of those were on Hail Marys or tipped passes. So 2 of them were legitimate interceptions, if you want to call them that. Fluid hips, good speed. Uh, you know, I think everybody hears Terry Arnold. They think he's a finished, polished product because a lot of mocks have him as a cornerback 1. And I think that's sort of a misnomer for him. I think he does still have a good bit of work to do, especially in press. His press technique is far from refined. Against Texas, which was the first game of the year, so you got to cut him a little slack. You know, you saw him getting beat on diamond releases by Xavier Worthy, stuff like that. But you would also saw, like I talked about, the growth against Georgia in the SEC championship game against Ladd McConkey. He held his own in press coverage. So I do see there's a lot of clay to work with. Really moldable guy, lots of traits. And, you know, in the NFL, especially these next 2 guys we're going to talk about, when you're looking at cornerbacks, you're also really looking at traits, because you can have a really solid collegiate cornerback, but if that guy just doesn't have NFL ready traits, you know, you can have as much production in college as possible, but if you just cannot translate that to NFL athletics, you know, it's just not going to make a difference, and you're going to end up falling out of the league.
Right. I mean, I think it's one of the more complicated positions to evaluate. Well,
Mhm.
I say that, but I generally just watch. I really have started focusing lately. Yes, of course, I want to know about their technique, but I really want to know how they move. What is what is their physical ceiling in terms of not only how they can move, how they can play in the run game, but also what do and don't they feel natural doing with their hands, right? We
Right.
could get into all kinds of metaphors about what I mean by that, but I hope we'll just explain it as we go. When I
Right.
watch Terrion Arnold, like you're saying, I see the best ball of clay in the draft. If
Yes.
not the best, he's up there. He is really young. You look at a guy like Terrion and a guy like Cam Hart, to use an
Yes.
example. This is a very unfinished way of talking about this, but Terrion is he may not be, maybe, the corner that Cam Hart is tomorrow, but you're not
Right.
drafting them to play tomorrow. That
Right.
2-year age gap makes a big difference. And
Right.
Terrion's going to he's 20 as we record this
Yeah.
podcast. He'll be 21 in just over a month. And
Yeah.
then at that point, you scale the fact that he's 21, Cam's 23. This stuff does make a difference, because the more you watch tape, you go, "Ooh, who's that? His technique is really good. He's 24." That
Yeah.
makes a lot of
Yeah.
sense.
And he's been at Notre Dame for 5 years, and I love Cam Hart, but yeah, I mean, it's like you said, it makes it that much more difficult to evaluate because I'm high on Cam Hart. I like him a lot, but I mean, Terrion Arnold, this is a guy that came in, recruited as a safety, got into a Nick Saban defense, was kind of, and yeah, he took his lumps, but he grew as the year went on.
Right.
And my only caveat, we kind of talked about this pre-show. I bring up the name Kalen King because we talked about him last year playing opposite Joey Porter Jr. Joey Porter Jr. last year was drafted in the second round, top of the second round. We all know with the Chase Claypool pick. He had a great year at Penn State, but opposite him was a guy named Kalen King who actually had better ball production, and going into this year was thought of as being one of, if not the best cornerbacks headed into, this draft class. We saw, Kalen King becomes a cornerback one, takes a big dip in production, has rough tape against teams like Ohio State, falls on his face at the Senior Bowl, and now he's getting talked about, maybe third round, maybe even fourth round. So I don't want to say that's going to happen to Terrion Arnold, but it's a projection when you're taking a guy that played against someone as high of a floor as Kool-Aid McKinstry, who is definitely getting the most, probably taking the toughest assignment. Terrion's getting, I don't want to say the easier assignment, but he's getting, probably the slightly less complicated or challenging assignment, and he's doing well with it. He's exceeding expectations. But when you're drafting him at the next level, if I'm a team drafting him, I'm probably hoping I already have an established cornerback one that I can put him opposite of, because if you're drafting him to be your top cornerback, you might be, I would say, underwhelmed because he still needs to be developed, and he probably will need that, that mentor to bring him along at the next level.
Well, and don't get me wrong, because I have my favorite, I guess, spot to draft nearly any position in the NFL. But this is a big part of why I tend to love drafting second round DBs, because especially if you're talking about corner, when you do take a rookie and you do throw them into the fire as your corner one, there's just all kinds of volatility in the lessons that they're going to immediately learn, especially because we talk about an Alabama corner here. Oh, you mean the guy that played alongside Dallas Turner, the guy who played alongside many more defensive
Right.
linemen that are going to be in this draft? I mean,
Right.
I'm not about to tell you that that the team he's going to play with, this being Terrion, at the NFL level isn't going to be better across the board. But in terms of relatively better, it's hard to beat Alabama.
Right.
And just because this was one of the lesser successful Alabama teams in the last, say, 15 years, doesn't mean they weren't really, really, really good. And I
Right.
know, Nick, I'm a believer that, and I think Jalen Johnson's the perfect example of this, if you will, the poster child, that corner is a very situationally dependent position when it comes to production. What
Yes.
you will produce matters a lot based on your pass rush, based on how well can your linebackers cover? Are your safeties a massive problem? And frankly, do you have somebody across from you that's good enough for offenses to be forced to push the ball your way?
Right.
Terrion is exactly that kind of guy where, because Kool-Aid and so many other pieces are going as well for him as they are, you're seeing the best of him. We'll
Mm-hmm.
talk about this at the safety, or when we get all the way to safeties. We could even talk about it, I guess, a little bit if we end up bringing up Kalen Carson. But there are plenty of these DBs where you realize they are not, they're getting avoided every chance
Yeah.
that team can avoid them, because so many other units and
Yeah.
so many other guys across the team are problems enough that why would you go with them when
Right.
you could go this other
Yeah.
direction? It's the biggest flaw in Terrion's profile, but he's exactly the kind of guy that, honestly, I would love to get him on a whiteboard so that you could understand his understanding of the
Mhm.
game. That's not something we're going to get to do.
Yeah.
Corner two.
Yeah. 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 So yes, next. So honestly, on my rankings, so we do it based out of 10, and it goes, Q has it set up so it's really like to the 1000th. But I have Quinion and Terrion 1/100th of a point in difference between CB2
Oh
and
my
CB3.
gosh.
So I see a lot of similarities between Mitchell and Terrion Arnold. And the reason I say that is I think Mitchell might have a higher ceiling than Arnold, to be honest with you. I see an explosive. I mean, I see a freak of an athlete on tape. I mean, his not just is he real not just is his burst through the roof, but his ball skills and instincts are what separate him from a lot of guys, because what I really like is, on like a comeback route, not only does he in off coverage, does he burst to that and break it up, he's really good at getting his hands in that passing window and break it up. A lot of the times you see a corner that he has a click and close, but he still lets the guy catch it. So yeah, he'll minimize the catch for maybe like 4 or 5 yards, but it's still a catch. What Quinion does, and he had 44 passes defensive the last 2 years, which was like the most in the
It's
NFL,
insane.
most in college of any defensive back. I mean, it's insane.
Insane.
He just gets his hand in there and he is constantly breaking up passes. He had 4 picks against Northern Illinois, though I don't know what that quarterback was doing in that game. It's so funny. They played Northern Illinois in 2022. He had 4 interceptions. And just like you mentioned a couple minutes ago, they play in 2023. I think they threw his way 3 times. He almost had 1 interception. They did not even look at his side of the field this year. I mean, it was, you could tell that they were just like, they were not going to let him come away with a pick. And like I said, I think he actually almost had 2 picks in that game, and they threw it to him like 3 times. So, Quinton Mitchell is just, that's a ball of clay that I think any defense, my dream team to draft him would be the Texans, because they play a lot of, Quinton Mitchell in an interview, they asked him, because he didn't play a lot of press man at Toledo. They played almost strictly off coverage and zone.
Yep.
And he played it because they played mostly quarters. He lined up in the same spot to kind of give that kind of look, regardless of what the call was. And I would love if the Texans could somehow grab him, pair him opposite Derek Stingley, and let D'Amico Ryans coach him. But I don't know if at 23 they'll be able to grab him. But yeah, Quinion Mitchell, I mean, again, his knock, the level of competition in the MAC is kind of, I mean, it is subpar compared to like, Terrion Arnold playing in the SEC. He's playing in the, they did play Ohio State and they played Illinois. And you notice when the competition got a little better, you could see some of his rawness on tape. He did, for a guy that runs, I mean, he's probably going to run out of the building at the combine, but you saw him in some of his, he'll be quick to open his hips up, and he's quick to, he can lose inside contain, because I think he's probably just not used to playing against higher competition. So that's why his Senior Bowl was so important, because he came out there and he just dominated against, the guys that are, the Roman Wilsons, the guys that are much better, I guess, that, NFL prospects, I should say.
Exactly.
And that was so important for him, because it showed he can play press. It showed he can play, dominate against higher competition. So I'll be real curious to see where he goes. I think he's going to be really good at the next level. I just think the step up in coaching, even though Toledo has a really good defense, no discredit to their coaching staff, but I just think that bump up in coaching is going to unlock so much of his potential.
I agree. I mean, Quinion Mitchell to me is one of those rare guys that you see on a small school's tape, because he plays corner, where you didn't realize how good an athlete he was, at least in my perspective, until he got to the Senior Bowl. And I went, oh, he's not losing feet with anybody.
Right.
And beyond that, I mean, when he's jamming guys in the conference that he's in, it's not that impressive. Like, don't get me wrong, it's really impressive on film. Those pass defenses don't come on accident, right? But like you're saying, he's rarely in press, so you don't see it often. And because you don't see it, it's the most basic assumption on earth to assume, well, then he probably can't do it, otherwise they would. Goes to the Senior Bowl, looks like a press man corner. I mean, through and through. His jam is unbelievable, and he's able, in many cases, to land the jam that most corners need 2 hands to land, but he does it with 1. Like, Quinion Mitchell is somebody that part of me honestly wonders, Nick, if we're still not high enough on him, because it's so easy in draft cycles to lock guys in on where you think that they are, and then you slowly move them up instead of any radical changes. The moment that somebody tells you Christian Watson's probably a 5th rounder, you just kind of bump him up to the 4th when he plays pretty well. And then fine, you twist my arm, bump him up to the 3rd. And then on draft day, he's picked it, I think, inside the top 40 in a trade up. So we can end up off on some of these guys at times. And I thought Quinion Mitchell had one of the most dominant Senior Bowls that I have seen in the 3 years that I've been going to the Senior Bowl, not just from a DB, from a player. And having watched Darnell Wright just last year, along with DeJuan Jones and a couple other guys that had themselves sweet senior bowls at the offensive line, defensive line side, you can get a feel for what these first round pick guys look like. And it
Right.
was very obvious after
Yeah.
day
Yeah.
one that everybody else was competing for a spot somewhere in day two. Not that guy.
Yeah.
That guy's going round one.
Yeah, and it's one of those things where because I think that he had like 1,100 coverage snaps at Toledo and maybe 100 of them were in press, but then at the same time, he's so fast and his burst is so good and off man. Why would you play him in press? Like unless because on one hand, yeah,
He
you
doesn't
want to see
need
that.
either.
Yeah, the coaches are trying to win the games, so they're not. I'm sure on some level they want to get him prepped for the NFL, but it's like this guy's so good in off man and zone where he can just sit and read the quarterback's eyes. We don't need to risk him in press because he plays off man like press because he's so fast on closing on the ball. So we'll just keep him in that. So yeah, it'll be. Like I said, I have him. I think he has the highest ceiling of any of these corners. I would love to see, I think the combine really could rocket him because I think he could have I think him and TJ Tampa both could have just in some insane numbers at the combine that shoot both of their stock way up. We'll get to TJ Tampa later, but I just think both with their athletic profiles, they could both just shoot out of the room.
Absolutely. And you mentioned all that off coverage and zone. I can't think of a better segue to talk about somebody that I
Ugh,
frankly think the conversation about gets just a little, I don't know. Let's talk about Cooper DeJean.
yeah, let me adjust myself in my seat because
I know,
yeah,
right? I'm certainly
it's
happy to
just
start. So
yeah,
obviously, when it comes to Cooper DeJean, following in the footsteps of Riley Moss, everybody wants to see, oh my gosh, are we gonna have the NFL's first starting cornerback that's white in
yeah,
an awfully long time? And I gotta tell you, for as many people as want to move Cooper DeJean to safety, he is pesky. I mean, as I think personally that it is tired when you see people comping people to only players that look like them, right?
right,
But
right.
for as many like Jim Rat and other jokes that you could make about the fact that Cooper DeJean is a white corner, he manages his route relationship with the wide receiver that he's facing very, very well. I
Yes.
personally think Cooper's technique is really impressive. And I don't think his athleticism matches the natural fluidity of some of the guys that we've seen, where if you told them, run here, then run there, then run there, you'd get guys like Kalen King in some cases that would be able to outmatch Cooper DeJean without too much trouble. But if you're looking for a corner that can be sticky in both man and zone situations, can be pesky with his hands both at the release point and further down the field, somebody who I think is constantly aware of what the quarterback is doing, which is not an easy thing to do while you're defending the man in front of you. And beyond that, you know what, Nick? If it doesn't work and you do want to move him to safety, you can get there later. But
Yes.
kind of like I've heard people talk about in the past, this was something EJ Snyder said to me 2, 3 years ago. It doesn't hurt you to start the kid at corner. Corner's
Yeah.
probably the more valuable position, anyways, much as I know that's a dagger to my heart because I love the position of safety. So if you are taking Cooper DeJean, I think you're doing it to play him at corner. Even though everybody wants to be cool and popular, saying, well, I think we could move him to safety. I think you got to play him at corner.
Yeah, it's a I had this conversation with someone. They said, do you think there's any blue chip defensive back prospects? And I threw out Cooper DeJohn's name and I said, just as a weapon, because I said, you're getting basically four players for the price of one. You're getting a guy that can play corner, he can play slot corner, he can play safety, box safety, and he can return punts and play. Then he can be a gunner on punt return. So I guess six players in one. So I don't know if that versatility, and I don't think it's a jack of all trades, master of none scenario. I think he can be good at all of them. Uh, you know, I have questions on if he can be a long-term outside boundary cornerback.
Sure.
Mainly, I don't know how to describe it. When I watch him against some slicker, more finesse wide receivers, I
You're
feel
thinking
like
about Malik Neighbors. Not to
yeah,
cut you off,
yeah,
but eventually Cooper DeJean is going to have to line up against guys like Malik Neighbors. And the moment that he does, that may be trouble,
Right.
right?
And
That's what's on your mind?
yeah, and I feel like he has and this is a problem with all taller cornerbacks, not just Cooper DeJean. I mean, this is a problem with TJ Tampa. There's a problem, not so much Nate Wiggins, but there's taller cornerbacks in general. It's tougher for them to sink their hips and close on, in breaking, out breaking routes. And this is a problem with Cooper. Uh, and it's funny because it is one of those things. Is it perception where it's, well, he's a white cornerback. So is it just, it's not the same thing with TJ Tampa. And it's how much of Cooper DeJean's athleticism. He's a super athlete. I mean, he was like a track and field star in high school. He scored more basketball points than Harrison Barnes in like the state of Iowa. I mean, he can do it all. It's just the lateral agility sometimes on film seems to be lacking a little bit. And I don't know if that's, for some of these players like a TJ Tampa, that seems more like it's something. I don't know how much of it is coachable out of it and how much of it is he just can't do it. And that's one of the questions where you have to juggle with some of the prospects. Is it a matter of physical, you've tapped out your physical potential, or is it a matter of it's just technique? And, Cooper played quarterback, so he's so good at sitting back and he can diagnose a route before the passes. He is so quick at diagnosing routes. He is so good at, he is so good at sitting in an off-man coverage and he plays wide receiver. I mean, he can run routes better than some of these wide receivers. And there's a pass against Eastern Michigan where it's like he ran a fade route for the wide receiver and toe tapped it at the back of the end zone. So, I mean, I agree with you. I think you start him out at cornerback. I think you could move him inside a slot if you really wanted to and have a slot safety. You could have that sort of versatility with him. I do question how NFL teams value that as far as draft capital. Like, is that worth a top 10 pick? Is that worth a top 20 pick?
Yeah.
If I'm the Packers, because I know their name's been linked to Cooper. I think the Lions have been, where do you put that sort of, would you take a Cooper DeJean over Nate Wiggins, for instance, or Terrion Arnold? How do you value that type of versatility? So that's really my only negative is it's tough to put a proper value on a player like that, who no doubt has value because his floor is so high. At the worst, you're getting a guy
Right.
that can be a very good safety and return punts really well, play special teams, and line up at safety and with a good defensive coordinator be a weapon. It's just, I don't, are you drafting him to be a shutdown cornerback? Because if you are, he's another one. He doesn't play a lot of press, but I mean, that's been a common theme for a lot of these cornerbacks. Their press technique has not been great for most of these cornerbacks. And it's going to continue, as you see, as it goes on, as a lot of these guys need to work on their press man. So it's not exactly something that keeps him isolated from the rest of the class. So is that something a coach feels confident he could work into him? Because if so, I think he's athletic enough to play outside corner. It's just, can is it his foot technique? Is he taking too many steps when he's opening his hips? Or it's just, so I think, I don't want to say he can't be. I would be curious where other teams value him. That's how it was tough for me to put a proper grade on him. Cause I'm like, where would I, as if I was a general manager, where would I value someone who's so unique like this in a sense?
I can't help seeing him as the changeup to the other corners that we've talked about's fastball, if that
Yeah.
makes sense.
Yeah.
I would say that the toughest hill that Cooper DeJean has to climb, and I do hope I'm getting his last name right. I'm just reading it as DeJean. Is it
Yeah.
DeJean?
I read it like Dijon mustard. So I do the same thing. I'm like Dijon, but I've heard DeJean.
But so Cooper's
sophomore
biggest
Iowa
mountain to
fans.
climb seems like we tend to scout corners and prioritize how they are in man. Not that zone can't, or not that man can't be taught as well, but
Mhm.
zone seems to be an area where a lot of guys mature as they get older throughout the league.
Right.
And yes, of course, just like pass rush traits, when Carl Brooks shows us that he's got special ability to recognize hands, D John or D Gene. Thank
DeJean.
you, Scott C. More to say that when you see Carl Brooks's hands working for him as a pass rusher, you can see that there is an acumen that these guys are able to carry to the next level. And ironically, because I think he would fit in Chicago, maybe he's just the Bears would want somebody a little longer, but
Yeah.
that's really splitting hairs. That cover 2, cover 3 system that the Bears are running so much, I think it fits a lot of what Cooper does really well with occasional pivots into man, but it is a different type of corner than we get used to talking about.
Right.
I don't think that that has to be as scary as we make it, just like how I think everybody lumps all these receivers into the category of receiver. And the moment that we start exclusively talking about things like separation numbers and top end speed, you start to eliminate all the X receivers
Mhm.
that end up surprising us out of the second round.
Right.
Whoa, who would have thought that the big man playing big can end up being really good
Yeah.
too?
Yeah.
I think we are putting Cooper in a box, and I
Right.
think he is too good to just be in a box. But
Exactly.
that reminds me a lot of Jack Campbell from last year, where in a similar way, we've been turning linebackers into 3-4 sub safeties. And here comes this old school linebackers that is a love letter to linebacking. And
Right.
and the Lions decide, I love that too. We're taking him first
Yeah.
round. So he's somebody I could see getting drafted almost anywhere. And it
Yeah.
would make sense to me.
Yeah. He seems like a Dan Campbell guy too, now that you mention it. So I wouldn't be surprised if, if Dan Campbell takes him. So
Well, that would be pretty cool.
yeah.
And speaking of cool,
Yeah.
we should talk about Kool-Aid
Yeah.
McKinstry. Were you telling me this is your number one corner on your board?
This was no, he's number 5, I
Gotcha,
believe.
gotcha. Who is
So
number one? Quinion?
uh
Wiggins?
I have it Wiggins 1, I've got Wiggins 1, Terrion 2, Quinion 3, Cooper 4, and then Kool-Aid 5.
So we're
But
running off your board here.
yeah,
That
yeah.
makes sense.
So
Uh-huh.
uh
Talk
I've
to me
got
about
No,
Kool-Aid.
I've had Kool-Aid. So Kool-Aid I had really high going into the scouting, and then he's kind of like, I guess every other person that scouted the DBs, he's kind of slowly been notched down. And, I think it's a little prospect fatigue. And, I think Kool-Aid has the highest floor of any of the cornerbacks because he's just been a steady Eddie his entire time at Alabama. He does his assignment. He does it well. He's the best press corner in the entire class, which there's not a lot of press corners in the class. So it's not exactly, I mean, maybe damning him with faint praise, but he's a really good press corner, really good zone corner. I mean, he can do it all. You saw this against Texas. The long speed is going to be his biggest bane. And I think sometimes we might tend to overrate how, I think Jalen Johnson had long speed concerns coming out of Utah. And it's one of those things where you never know if it's how bad it's going to be. And I certainly don't think Kool-Aid, it's debilitating to the point of where I've seen people mock him mid-second, late second. I think he should still he's still a first round talent to me. Like I said, he's got such a high floor as a DB. Uh, I think he's just one of those guys that what's his ceiling going to be? What the player you draft is probably going to be the player you get who is going to be a really solid cornerback for the next 8 to 10 years. I don't know how many Pro Bowls he'll make, but he'll probably be a guy that's going to be a mainstay on anyone's defense. And he's going to be a great guy. Both the Alabama defensive backs, they both get grabby downfield. Him and Terrion had this issue. I don't know if that's coached in them by Nick Saban. If he's like, if they beat you, just grab them. And that could be a coaching point and a lot of times they get away with it. And at the next level, they're going to call it, but that'll probably be coached out of him. I honestly think Saban probably tells him to do that just so they don't get hit with a big play. But yeah, I mean, outside of his long speed and his grabbiness, I think he's really good in run support. But yeah, I have him as a high floor kind of, I don't want to say low ceiling, but I would say of the other 4, he's probably got the lowest ceiling of the first 4 that we've talked about. So that's kind of why he slots in as my number 5 cornerback.
Kool-Aid is somebody that, to be honest with you, I have not studied like I think you have. Definitely not, because he was somebody that I immediately saw as the Bears are not going to get anywhere near him. So I just did not think
Right.
about it much. But the story that you're telling me reminds me of what I've seen from Javon Bullard this year in Georgia. But to go back even further, guys like Jordan Battle in or guys like Keely Ringo. What do they all have in common, Nick? Well, I'll lay it plain. They're the number 1 DB on a good team
Right.
that wins a lot and has moments where they did something really successful, and otherwise you weren't really watching them.
Right.
So
Right.
they end up getting quite a brand because not that many corners and safeties end up with a brand during the
Right.
college football season. And then you get to the part where you watch them on a play-to-play basis, and well, Maybe they just weren't quite as good as you wanted them to be at the time.
Yeah,
Now,
it's
mhm.
yeah, go ahead.
No, that's basically it. What
Yeah,
were you thinking?
I was gonna say I would definitely Keely Ringo's a good comp. I would say I think he fell to the 5th. I definitely think Kool-Aid's a much better prospect, but that's a good example of, you do helmet scouting, you see a guy on UGA on like their record-shattering defense, and you're like, well, he's got to be good. He's on, he was on the UGA defense. He's a starting number 1 cornerback, and then he falls in the 5th round of the Eagles, and everyone's like, what happened to that guy? And I don't think it's if and when Kool-Aid becomes the 4th or 5th cornerback off the board, people are going to be saying the same thing. I thought this guy was supposed to be really good. And I think he is good. I think he's very good. I think anybody that drafts him, like I said, if the Eagles take Kool-Aid and put him opposite Darius Slay, they're going to be happy. They're going to have someone that they can rely on in a Vic Fangio defense who's not going to make any mistakes. And he's going to be a solid CB2 until Darius Slay retires or, they replace him. But I don't know if he'll ever be a CB1. I don't know if he'll ever elevate his game to that level at the NFL level, but just because I think his ceiling is just a little lower with his athletic profile, which isn't a total knock on him. I just think with the NFL, with the way it's trending and what you're looking for out of your cornerbacks now, I don't think he has that ceiling that teams are looking for. And that's kind of why he's fallen down boards.
I can't help but think that CB1 in particular is a role that as we discuss it, it keeps changing. I
Mhm.
think that the old school definition of CB1, lockdown, shutdown corner. Look, I love Jalen Johnson. I wanted Jalen Johnson extended last year. Jalen Johnson has guys that he doesn't match up amazingly well against.
Right.
You just cloud those receivers in cover
Mhm.
3, which just means you put a safety over the top
Right.
over him and you don't worry about it. And you let
Right.
Jalen,
Yeah.
you let Jalen sit underneath, or you play cover 2 to deal with the same problem. I tend to think that Kool-Aid can be a very important and vital part of a defense that's got the pieces around him to allow
Yes.
him to play a role. Just don't ask him to be a top 10 corner in the
Right.
NFL, especially not out of the gate. And I personally think you'll be fine. That's just a hard class of player to break through, anyways. And
Right.
we've got ourselves a bit of a lightning round because
Yes.
we really did dig on some of these
Yes.
guys.
Yeah, these
So
top 5 so good.
let's rip off a couple
Yeah.
names real
So
fast.
we'll go through, I've got TJ Tampa, nuts and bolts of him. He is built like the Predator. He's got pterodactyl arms. Long story short on TJ Tampa, another guy that didn't play a lot of press at Iowa State, played almost exclusively off man and zone. Uh, this is a guy that against AD Mitchell against Texas, he can go and he can be a wide receiver neutralizer. Gets his hands in there, deflects passes because his arms are insanely long to like tree branches. Needs to refine his game, just needs to get better at playing the position. Still raw, kind of has deep zone mishaps where you see him bumping into teammates just because he's got spatial issues in zone. But a guy that if you can get him in the 2nd round and you can coach him up, I think he's going to probably jump a 40-inch vertical and he's probably going to run 4.3, 4.4. And for a 6'2" cornerback, he's probably going to get overdrafted, but he's going to end up, if he can get coached properly, I think he'll be really good.
I think he'll be really, really good. And I would
Yeah.
have a lot to say about DJ Tampa, but we even have an other Bears fits section coming up,
Yeah.
and that is 4 players away. So we got to
Yeah.
get moving, right? I'm with you though.
Yeah.
If Tampa needs anything, it's time. And that's
Yes.
okay.
Yeah.
Like he's young enough. The physical skill you see. My favorite part is when you look at some of these string bean corners and then you look at what their right hook, by that I mean their jam,
Yeah.
like does to the opposing DB, and boom, the
Yeah.
wide receiver stops. I'm like, yes, these
Yeah.
are my guys. Plus, Tampa is violent in the run game. We love that.
Yes.
Kentucky's Andrew Phillips is one of my favorite types of corners because when I
Yes.
originally watched his tape, I saw somebody who was wickedly fast, but he was a 5'10 corner that plays in a hunch. So
Yes.
he has almost an effective height of, say, 5'7. And I couldn't help but find myself thinking, okay, I don't like doing this, but as a height, weight, speed fan, I have to dock him, make him a nickel corner until I went to Mobile. And let me tell you what, Nick, Andrew Phillips came with a point to prove. And there's something that really matters to me when I can especially see a DB, because these environments are not kind to DBs in the slightest.
Mhm.
Go up against Johnny Wilson, stone him. Go up against Lad McConkey, compete. Go up against it was the South Carolina Xavier Leggett
Oh, yeah.
receiver, Xavier Leggett, give him problems.
Right.
Drew Phillips on I think it was the American roster, the
Mhm.
second practices was an issue for a
Yeah.
lot of these receivers. And that just, you want to woo me with your
Yeah.
competitiveness, because that's the kind of thing. Like, I know that this sounds so silly. We all know this. It's just a fact of the draft that there are some of these players that love what football does for them. And there are
Mhm.
some of these players that love football. And Drew Phillips in that Senior Bowl week, and when you go back and you watch him fight and scrape in the run game,
Yeah.
despite him not being a big guy, man, that's the kind of guy you go, if he's there in the fourth, if he's there in the fifth,
Yeah.
we're going to get a sweet special teamer. Like, I'm not worried about his contributions on special teams.
Right.
We might just have ourselves a corner while we're
Yeah.
at it.
Yeah, he was one of the first guys I scouted, and when I was, it was early on, no one else had talked about him, and I was reading scouting reports just to get familiarize myself with him, and they're saying 6th or 7th round, and I'm watching him against UJ, and I'm like, there's no way this guy lasts until he's going man to man with Brock Bowers, and he's beating him. Like, there's no way. What am I missing? And I put it out to Q, and I'm like, this Drew Phillips, I think he's going to be good. And I've never scouted cornerbacks before. This is the first time and I'm like, am I missing something here? Like, I'm told to trust my eyes, and what am I missing? And my favorite story from the Senior Bowl is someone tweeted that there was a guy that was violently hitting what is it called? The things that the offensive linemen hit when they're doing
Mhm.
that
Mhm.
drill. And the coaches at the run be like, dude, chill. And it was Drew Phillips. He was over there just bashing them and turning them over. And it's just, you see that on tape though. Sometimes you think they're just turning it on for the game, and then they go and they turn it off and it's just a charade. And for him, that's just, I think, who he is. And yeah, he was one of my favorite players I scouted. And now he's kind of getting that buzz that, now he's climbing up draft boards, and rightfully so. But yeah, he is a guy that I really enjoyed watching. And I think he's going to be a really good corner because he does play bigger than he is. And he's a tenacious cornerback. So
Mhm. Now you put Missouri's Ennis Rakestraw on here. Tell
yes,
me about him.
I like Ennis Rakestraw. He's another guy that I think you would like. He's a very feisty cornerback. He's 6'0". He's another wiry framed outside corner. One story I like about him, he was getting offers from Alabama and Texas, and he chose Missouri. And there's a really good video of the coach of Missouri just freaking out because he pretty much turned around that Missouri defensive program because he was a huge recruit, came in, made a big difference on the Missouri defense. Great press corner, great outside corner or off man corner, great zone corner. The only thing with him is injuries. He tore his ACL in 2021, missed a Senior Bowl with an injury, missed time this year with an injury. And again, he's really active in run support, but almost to the point of where he's a little too aggressive. So he can miss tackles. And it's also, he's so thin framed that you worry that might be causing some of these injuries. So you kind of want to see him put some muscle on. But I have him as I think CB 7 or 8. I have him as a early second, mid second round cornerback, and I think he's going to be a really good corner in the league. I won't be drafted by the Bears, but he is a guy that if you can put a little weight on him, he'd be a really good press corner, and he's a really good versatile all around corner, has inside outside versatility. So someone that I think keep an eye on as the draft gets closer.
You're touching on one of the harshest parts about evaluating corners. And I am of the belief that modern cornerbacks are going through the same thing that modern pitchers in baseball are going through. And that's that we are beginning to push the limit of what the human body can do,
Yes.
as far as we need guys, of course, that they're big enough to
Mhm.
compete with Justin Jefferson, especially physically. They need to be big enough and they need to be strong enough to compete with guys like DK Metcalf's probably a better example. AJ Brown's probably a better
Right.
example. Mike Evans is probably a better example. But also, if they line up Tyreek Hill on the outside,
Yeah.
we got to have a guy that can run with him too. So you end up with so many of these body types where they look very tall but very thin.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because they need to somehow be 6'1", 6'2", but also like 195
Yeah.
pounds.
And that's
Because
why,
if
yeah.
they're 208, then how fast can they really run? And like you're talking about, we hit the stage where I'm looking at a guy like Jalen Johnson, and I'm thinking to myself, well, if you can only miss like 4 games a year, I guess that's fine.
Yeah. Yeah.
Just because
Yeah.
it's hard to find a modern corner that can play all 17 games on purpose. I mean,
Yeah,
well, of course they're going to intend to, but consistently, right?
right.
A lot of the guys that are consistently healthy are just not at that level. So
Exactly.
hopefully Rakestraw can figure it out, but you might be able to get yourself a good player on a flyer at that
Right.
point. Moving on. We got one of my favorite corners, somebody who I thought had himself a good week, not amazing, but a good week at the Senior Bowl. But because he plays for Rutgers, he's gone
Mhm.
underrated, and that's Max Melton. If you've heard that name before, your ears aren't fooling you. This is Bo Melton, current Green Bay receiver, also former Rutgers grad's brother, playing corner. And he, I think, is all kinds of fun because we talk about those string beans with punch. Max Melton has no fear. No fear. Fearlessness, I think, defines him. He's willing to mix it up with anybody of any size. I thought his game against Ohio State was quite solid, all things considered. I mean, this is a team that'll rip up any corner, especially with
Right, right.
Maserati Marv out there.
Yeah, yeah,
Melton, I think, brings you power in the run game. He's one of the better running or run playing corners, I think, in the class, if memory serves. And also, I think he gives you legitimate juice in pass coverage that some of these other corners can't quite provide. There are some fun corners that we just don't get the chance to talk about in a show this short, like Mike Sainristil out of
right.
Michigan, smaller guys that are probably going to get relegated onto the inside. Max isn't one of those. This is a guy that you're probably going to be able to get. I mean, craziest case scenario, he's going in the third, but no way, right? Probably the fourth, just based off of what we're seeing from all these other height, weight, speed guys. Like another one we haven't talked about, the Oregon corner,
Mhm.
who what is his name? Kyrus
Yeah, he's like a
something.
I forget his what is it? I have it right here. Kyrie Jackson.
Kyrie Jackson,
Yeah,
where it's like those height, weight, speed plus premier
right,
program plus
right,
legitimate
right,
CB1 experience. That's going to draw a lot of eyes that in a tie break, I don't want to say because they would never admit it out loud. These
right.
scouts would never admit it out loud, right? That
Exactly. Yeah,
the tie break between Rutgers and Oregon would be the school, but
yeah.
who knows? I
And
really like what I've seen from Max.
when you get to that level of, 4th, 5th round, Matt Eberflus is gonna look for guys that can stop the run, especially at cornerback, because that he puts such a like, it's such a paramount philosophy of his defense. Last year's entire free agency, and you could argue the draft class was revolved around, "We're gonna stop the run," and I think some of these, reluctancy you see in some of these cornerbacks to not stop the run is going to take them almost completely off the Bears board. So you get someone like Max Melton that has no fear at stopping the run and no fear against manning up. So I think that goes a long way with guys like Matt Eberflus and Ryan Poles, because it's a lot easier to pull that back than to coach that into someone.
Right.
I feel like getting someone to maybe pull back a little bit than trying to amp them up. It's probably a coach's worst nightmare, trying to have to juice someone up. So you want a guy that you can maybe just take it back a little bit. So I think he fits that profile really well.
Man, that is such a beautiful way to surmise Tyreek Stevenson and the decision to draft him
Yes.
in a tiny nutshell. You would way rather pull somebody back than push somebody forward,
Right.
which is a big part of why I am so fond of Wake Forest Kalen Carson. I mean,
Yes.
this is not a guy who, by any stretch of the imagination, is playing fair football right now. I
Right.
mean, you mentioned it in your scouting report that you released just a couple days ago. To say he's a bit too grabby is underselling it in a
Yeah.
drastic way. This is somebody who, the moment he gets a chance, is going to grab you, and he's going to do the same thing offensive tackles do, where his goal is to just hold you in place
Yes.
so that he doesn't get the flag, which would not work if he wasn't so good at it,
Yeah.
right? Like
Yeah.
he is, at least from what I've seen, fearless in physical
Yes.
battles, and he doesn't win them all. For instance, I think if you want to see a wide receiver and a corner duking it out, I think his game against Florida State, where specifically he goes up against Keon Coleman, and Keon
Mhm.
gets better of him plenty of times, but I think Keon's one of the most physical receivers in this class. So
Yeah.
that's as close as I think you're going to get to seeing what Kalen looks like in the NFL. And it's funny because as much as I've sat here, Nick, and I've ranted to you about his physicality, it's his anticipation on underneath routes that really sold me. A
Yeah.
lot of corners will give up all kinds of things underneath, but he is just as fearless about playing on his front foot and driving on those underneath footballs. And I find that something that is really important in the NFL, because if you can take what should have been 2nd and 4 and it's 2nd and 10 because you
Right.
got there, or even just because the receiver heard you and didn't haul the ball all the
Mhm.
way in, this changes a series. And
Yeah.
especially as the NFL goes further and further towards bend, don't break football, a player like that, who's also 6 foot and also, I think he might be taller than 6 feet. It's kind of hard to tell.
Yeah, yeah, I think
Mhm.
he might be 6'1". It'll be interesting what he measures at, but yeah, I definitely think he has a good size to play cornerback, so
I think
outside
so.
corner. I saw the same thing. I saw tenacious. I saw him very physical run stopper, very quick feet, fluid hips. Like you said, um that's one of the things when we were talking about some of the bigger cornerbacks, like the Cooper DeJean, even guys like TJ Tampa, or we haven't talked about Cam Hart, but he's another great example. Those in breaking routes where the cornerback kind of has to sit back and click and close, which click and close is where he reads the quarterback, he sees what he's going to do, and then he closes that space between
Right.
when the wide receiver makes his break and he's going in and the defensive back closes on the gap. Kalen Carson closes that like that. And that is
Mhm.
such a huge benefit to any team because, like you said, that breaks up the pass. And for these offenses now that are a lot more quick hitting and a lot more, let's just drive up the field, quick, quick, quick. That's a huge boon to have a cornerback that breaks those up. That's what Quinyon Mitchell does really well, is to break those passes up. And these bigger, the bigger cornerbacks, they have issues because their hips can't flip that quickly. They'll lose speed. They'll dip back a little bit. Their hips don't sink as low. So it's just, it's more of a rounded kind of movement. And, they might tackle the player and it'll be a minimal gain, but a player like Carson will break that pass up. And that's what you like to
Mhm.
see. I didn't have a lot of weaknesses for Carson. I mean, really my only weaknesses I saw on the Keon Coleman, and this was, Coleman's a bigger receiver than Carson. I would just like, for a guy as good at batting passes away, you kind of want to see those maybe turn into interceptions a little bit more. And he did seem to get on the two, I think I think both touchdowns, because Coleman caught 2 touchdowns. I think
Yes,
on one of
did.
the touchdowns, it was just a vertical route. And it seemed like Carson kind of struggled to turn his head around. And I know it's on in a couple other plays, but it's just, those aren't, I, those are minor flaws, to be honest. Those
Carson.
are not things that worry me. Those are just, a player that is probably maybe trying to do a little too much, trying not to lose his man and just didn't turn around fast enough. Not something I worry about.
We are always going to struggle with the relative nature of scouting football players, right?
Right.
Is Devontae Walker bad, or is Nate Wiggins just better than him?
Exactly.
Right. And one of the pieces to this whole scouting puzzle that, hey, Nick, this is what I believe. You do not have to believe it. Is I still think Keon Coleman is really underrated. I think he is a player that moves simultaneously like a Z receiver, because I mean, the guy returns punts, but
Right.
also plays like he's got AJ Brown's physicality at
Yes.
times. And
Mhm.
somebody like Kalen Carson not being able to overpower him is, I think, to Keon's credit, more so than it's something to take away from someone
Right.
like Kalen Carson. Now, I will say, I think Kalen's start is fine, and I think his stop is pretty bad.
Yeah.
So, in terms of stop start routes, or if a player
Right.
like Lad McConkey can break inside of him very quickly, that's
Mhm.
a weak area. But
Yeah.
I'm noticing a lot of corners that struggle with this.
Yeah.
It's
It's
his hips are not Keely Ringo's hips, which I do think will keep him in a higher round conversation, because
right.
Ringo's hips were really stiff,
Yeah.
really stiff. But this goes back to the same conversation people have had about guys like Lad McConkey for quite
Mhm.
some time. He's my favorite one at the moment, where it's like, if nobody can stop Lad, maybe
Yeah.
Lad's just a problem.
Yeah. Yeah.
And, and
Yeah, it's
but
all frame of reference, matter of perception, however you want to say it. It's maybe that guy's just really good, because that's the
right.
same thing with TJ Tampa. He has the same thing with struggling to come out of his back pedal on those in breaking routes, and but then it's also, you kind of see against Texas. Well, if it's Xavier Worthy, maybe that's because it's Xavier Worthy and not
Right.
because it's TJ Tampa. So
Right.
yeah, it's always, you look at the traits and you just hope that, some of these traits are really good. And I think Kalen Carson is going to be I think he's going to be a steal. So
And you hope that those guys are going to get hidden by matchups a little bit, where you
Right.
look at somebody like, let's use a best example, TJ Tampa. I hope we don't match him up against Xavier Worthy in
Right.
as often as we can. And if we do, then I hope we pay attention
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
get him some help, because like you're talking about, the moment that you match, favorite example here would be the moment that you match a guy like Cam Hart up against Tyreek Hill, you're
Yeah.
gonna lose,
Yeah. Yeah.
especially if he turns deep and you
Right.
gave him no help. Like, there are pieces to cornerbacking, especially, that
Right.
once you get to the NFL, what can the DB do for you? What can't they do for you?
Right.
Where does all of this fit together? And as far as other Bears fits that we have 5 minutes or less before we're
I
gonna
know
get rushed off
Kamari
the game.
Lassiter was brought up a few times. So I think it's worth talking about him. I have him ranked fairly high. I don't have off the top of my head where I have him ranked. I liked Kamari Lassiter. I kind of have him as he's basically, I think, a less athletic, more polished Terrion Arnold, if that makes sense. Like
Okay.
he's a really I mean, it makes sense in the sense of Kirby Smart came from Nick Saban. So those defensive backs are always going to be pretty well technically sound. And Kamari Lassiter is no different. He's he's a screen disruptor. He gets into the backfield. He'll play the run. He is one of the guys. He plays really good off man coverage. My other notes. I think he has pretty good recovery and long speed. And I also thought he was still pretty raw as a prospect. I thought in zone there was some miscommunication issues that I noticed and spacing issues. Overall, I think he's a good zone cornerback. I mean, these are like nitpicky things because
Sure.
you're looking at tape and you're just kind of, some of these prospects, like a prospect is technically sound, I think, is Lassiter. Some of his, I have eyes can linger a bit in the backfield. But really the only thing I think is a major knock on Lassiter, he only had one interception in 3 seasons, and I think only had 14 total passes defensed at Georgia in 3 years. So the ball skills are really the only thing you want to see improve as a cornerback. Um, I think, he's one of those guys too that's kind of tough to judge where he's going to go in the draft, because I've seen him as high as the first round. I've seen him in the second round. So it'll be curious. He's another high floor guy for me. So, I think you're getting a pretty good cornerback in him, but I just don't know where I would draft him.
I got the awesome opportunity at the Senior Bowl to hang out with a former scout
Oh, nice.
he's a former scout for the Steelers. But as I was hanging out with him, a couple people asked him about a couple different players, and he hit every single one of them with this mechanical saying that you could tell he'd been saying for years. Nick, he said, "I haven't watched him, so I can't comment on him." And that's all he'd say. Like, somebody tried to press him on the issue, he'd say, "I haven't watched him, so I can't comment on him." When it comes to Amari Lassiter, I haven't watched him,
There you
so
go.
I can't comment
Yeah,
on it,
there
right?
you go.
The 2 names from the Senior Bowl that I have on my list and I want to go back to, because I have noticed it's not a disease, it's just something to talk about, Nick, where if the NFL draft community has not heard of player X, they will sit in the 250 range on most prospect boards until suddenly they aren't. Like
Right.
a couple weeks later, when it's obvious they got watched. At the Senior Bowl, 2 guys in the American practice. It was Carlton Johnson out of Fresno State, and it was Jarvis Brownlee Jr. out of Louisville.
Oh,
Looked great. And I have not watched a snap of their film, but they were 2 relatively decent sized corners. I mean, we're talking about let's see, Brownlee is 5'10 and a half. Johnson was 5'10 and a half. So I guess 5'10 and a half on both. Smaller. They're not big and long. So I don't know if they're going to be Bears fits, but they were
right.
so fast that I
Right.
was like, whoa, okay.
Yeah.
Because smaller or at least lesser known guys, again, DBs especially, are going to suffer from that. Whereas it's the guys that like Sione Vaki, who we'll talk about here in just a little bit,
Yeah.
that they're going to get all kinds of credit because, hey, you can play running back too,
Yeah.
right?
Right.
And it was fun watching those 2. I don't know what that means for their future, but they're 2 names that if you end up hearing them, you heard it because of the Senior Bowl.
Yeah. And there's only one other guy real quick. I just want to mention him because I just watched him today and he was kind of an interesting guy. Once I did more research, Dwight McGlothern out of Arkansas, probably a late 6th, 7th round guy, maybe highest rated cornerback on PFF, whatever that's worth. Missed games due to injury. Came from not Alabama. He transferred from, it was another SEC school, LSU, but really big gambling cornerback. Goes for the takeaway. So he could be a guy that maybe Matt Eberflus wants to develop because of how much he, takes advantage of takeaways. So just a name to keep in the back of your head if they're throwing darts at the end of the draft.
Right. And that's what it's going to be. So thank you guys so much for tuning in. Hope we got to dig into your favorite player. If not, hit us up on Twitter. I'm at Robert K. Schmitz. He's at sniper_1154. We'll be right back with you here. Probably going to take a small water break and then we'll hit safeties while we're at it. But this has been Building the Board. We can't wait to bring you guys some of the best Chicago Bears draft content possible. Until next time, we'll see you later.
See you later.